karakia tātou. I think first thing we'll do is kick off with a karakia, and then we'll get into it. Ko rangi, ko papa, ka puta, ko rongo, ko tānei mahuta, ko tangaroa, ko tūmatange, ko haumia tiki tiki, ko tā whirimātia. Tokona te rangi ki runga, ko papa ki raro, ka puta te ira tangata ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama. Tihei, Māori ora. Tēnā koutou everyone, welcome to this webinar on water allocation in Hawke's Bay, returning to the river. Te mana o te wai, te Matau Māui. My name is Tom, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this event tonight. I'm here because I grew up in Hawke's Bay. I actually recognize some of the names of the people who are joining us as attendees today from Hawke's Bay. I've worked in sort of the freshwater space for quite a while through Forest and Bird in an advocacy role as one of the regional managers for the region covering Hawke's Bay and engaging in water sort of discussions around freshwater in Hawke's Bay, and worked with some of the panelists on those issues across the country. And I don't work for Forest and Bird anymore. I currently work at a place called Kahungunu Environmental, but having grown up in Hawke's Bay and done a lot of sort of advocacy there, and having my name tagged on a lot of submissions and things like that in the region, I'm kind of here to help facilitate the discussion that we're having about the policy and the situation and the ecological implications of what's going on in Hawke's Bay. But that's enough about me. Tonight we're talking about the impact of commercial interests, basically taking substantial quantities of water from rivers and aquifers in Hawke's Bay, but also in New Zealand. This is an issue that we have across the country that many of you are probably familiar with if you're joining us today. The speakers we've got are, in no particular order, Ngaio Tiuka, who is an absolute sort of champion of environmental work in Hawke's Bay. He's Director of Environment and Natural Resources at Ngāti Kahungunu. Has been working in this te taio space for nearly 10 years. We've got Marnie Prickett, who's a freshwater campaigner from Choose Clean Water, who leads the group Choose Clean Water, and she's been campaigning for several years on freshwater and freshwater issues across New Zealand. We've got Levi Walford-Smith, who is a youth worker in Hawke's Bay, and Levi's professional background is supporting rangatahi, and which translates kind of into exploring te taio and learning about whakapapa and people and land and mātauranga and tikanga, and last but not least, and actually joining us internationally, as I understand it, probably from some crazy hour of the day, is Logan-Riley, who's co-founder of Te Ara Whatu, which is a group of young Māori and Pacifica climate activists. And as I understand, she's overseas for that exact reason, but I'll leave that to her to introduce. So without any further delay, I'll throw over to our first speaker, Marnie, and then we can have a look at this awesome film that's been produced, and then have some discussion with each of our panelists. So Marnie, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Hey, kia ora everybody, and hi to the people out there, the 45 people that we've got with us, which is really great. I'm sorry you'll be able to hear my wee dog barking in the background. Hopefully she's not too distracting. So yeah, Choose Clean Water and ActionStation, Elliot was reminding me, we started talking about this project about at the end of last year, really. And what we were thinking about was that the general sort of New Zealand public had really gotten the idea quite embedded in their minds about the quality of rivers and the amount of pollution that was actually going into our rivers, into our aquifers, into our streams, and then out into the ocean. So that kind of idea of a lot of contaminants in New Zealand's waterways was something that people had really understood, and I'd say that we're a remarkable country in that we probably have the greatest understanding of nitrate in waterways per capita than any other country in the world. Probably we've been talking about it so much in public for the last few years, but we were really thinking that the conversation around what it takes and the amount of water that's being taken out of our across the country, that hadn't that hadn't sort of grown along with the conversation about pollution, that there are a lot of people involved in water and are involved in water campaigning and being kaitiaki of waterways, and they're all very well aware of quantity issues, but the wider public hasn't kind of quite had the same level of conversation about the fact that we are taking an enormous amount of water out of our waterways, that our waterways are suffering because of it, that our groundwater is suffering because of it, and that we are really creating a lot of vulnerability for our people and our communities across the Motu as we take too much water away. So we wanted to go back to a sort of staple of Choose Clean Water campaigning, which is telling local stories, telling stories that have a single sort of voice of that region, telling us what is going on in that region, what the pressures are on the environment there, and what the consequences are for the people and the wildlife that are there. And so we put together this project to make these 4 videos. So we've got 4 regions that we're focusing on. Not surprisingly, they are East Coast regions of the country, because that's where we're seeing a lot of the pressure at the moment, just because of the nature of the climate in that part of the country. So we're going to see tonight the Hawke's Bay film, which features Ngaio, who's here with us tonight. We're going to see that tonight, and then in the future we'll see the Wairarapa video, Canterbury, and then a video from Otago. So they will be telling stories about what's happening to particular rivers down there. And if you stay with us and you watch those films over time, you'll see that while these stories are specific to the region, and they are they have real implications for the people of that region, there's a common theme, and the common theme is that we are taking too much, and that we have to return water to the rivers now. We have to give it back. And that requires councils, and councils particularly, to take water off irrigators, because that's where the pressure is being put on. It's a really important time to be thinking about this, because the central government is starting to talk about an allocation framework at central government level. I personally am worried about that, and we can talk a little bit about why I'm concerned about what that looks like. And also, it's a really important time for you in your regions, and you, if you are a Hawke's Bay resident and you're listening to this, in the next few years, a lot of regional plans are coming up, a lot of decisions are getting made on how much water is taken, and the more that we can engage at regional level, the better, because a lot of the real gritty decisions get made at local government level. The central government, they get made at regional level. And so part of the intention of these films is also to gather support in the region, to gather a bit of a network in the regions that we can hopefully support, to engage more, to campaign more at regional level, to have some of those tools of campaigning and some of that policy support where it's needed. This is not the idea is not to take over what's happening in the region, but to hopefully build that network and build that capacity and support the capacity of people on the ground to really push their councils to do what's right for the rivers. So you'll see us talking about Te Mana o Te Wai tonight. That is the great hope of this new freshwater policy, is Te Mana o Te Wai, and the concept that concept and the obligation that councils have to put the river first. The health of the river must come first, and then we can look at drinking water, and then only after the health of the river and the health of the people is taken care of, then we can consider commercial interests. And so that's a real shift in where we've been in New Zealand water management. And so that's the hope that councils have to get there. So we're about to, just before we start the film, I'll just note that we are going to be collecting people's names and their emails if they want to be part of that regional network and that regional support. Elliot's going to put a link to a Google form that you can fill out if you're interested in that. We won't be sending the email addresses and names out to anybody. It's just a beginning of building that support network, so we can get people more engaged and help them be more engaged if they need it. So stick around for the speakers after the film. You won't be able to hear my dog through the film, thank goodness. Just a little note that we've done our best to make sure that the film is not going to be too jumpy. We noticed today when we were checking it that it was a little bit, that the visuals were a little bit jumpy. The sound was great and okay, so apologies for that. If you want to watch the film unadulterated and not jumpy over a webinar, you can do that on our YouTube this evening. It'll be up on our YouTube page after this. And so yeah, I hope that you enjoy this movie. I hope that it tells the story that we were hoping to tell, and I hope that it prompts some good discussion for afterwards. So take it away. And
Here taunga hauku nui, here taunga ararau, here taunga haro te kahu, here taunga takotono. I'm imaginary skimming.
Darling and a good skim.
Just swinging off the trees and bombing into the water. Just thought that was all natural and it would always be here. And now we've got kids going to rescue eels. You've seen these eels crawling into the mud trying to hide from the sun, and no water in the stream. It's no longer a stream. The problem we have here in Heretaunga Plains is that there's not enough water to go around. It's been this over-emphasis on providing irrigators with as much water as they want. The demand is growing too fast to be sustainable, and it's having these adverse impacts on others in the community.
You could just imagine this being really deep, because you can see how up there it's shallow and then it just comes down like a huge foam. But I think under those like grass and stuff over there'll be like eels and fish hiding.
My son and my daughter like to see what lives in the river, all the life in it. I just like seeing that glow and that interest on their face, and the excitement to be part of it, and I want that to continue for them and their children. This is part of their pepeha. It's part of the whakapapa of the way to connect with what your ancestors connect with the whenua, with the waterways. We're not just saying words that ko ngariroro te awa, but you're immersing yourself with those waterways and you're understanding what made it so important for your tupuna, for your forefathers. And the reason it's part of our pepeha is because it sustained us. Behind me is the Heretaunga Plains, the city of Hastings you can see. These plains were created by a number of rivers we have here. They're flowing down from the hills. We have the Tutaikuri, then the Ngariroro and the Karamu, and just over the other side we have the Tukituki. The waterways still flow underground and overground, and they're all connected, it's all intertwined. All these streams, along with our big major river system, they all contribute to the groundwater. For tangata whenua, the ukaipo, that fresh water from the mountains, you just can't beat it, and we're really fortunate here in Heretaunga that essentially that fresh pristine water that comes from those ranges and through the forests comes underground, and we have it right here on our doorstep.
How come the water is not restored? Because if the water all came from somewhere, then how come it's not still coming?
If you think of all these straws going into these lands, sucking out water, some people have got a bigger straw and they can take out more than others. The population has grown, but that's been a relatively steady increase of water by and large, well over 50% of the water takes is from irrigation. And the risk is that's going to continue. You see the springs flows dropping, and we think we just take more groundwater and flow it chuck it into the stream, or we do more water storage. That's the opposite of sound, sustainable water management. Our waterways shouldn't have to rely on a consent to replace our springs with taps. The private benefiting businesses, industries, they can exist in Heretaunga, and they have for decades. But where it starts impacting on the general public and those basic necessities of life, then that's a step too far, and that's contrary to respecting Te Mana o Te Wai. The first right should be to the waterways itself. What does it need to sustain itself, to keep the river going, to respect its mana, to respect its mauri, and then we look at people. Everyone should have an ability to drink from it or to immerse and swim in these waterways. And we're trying to have that conversation after too much water's been given out. And that's a hard conversation to have, but it needs to be had. The greater the loss of streams, the greater the loss of our communities to interact with the environment, and they just feel helpless. You know, if we're supposed to be tangata whenua, an obligation for kaitiakitanga, then arguably we're failing in that regard. We have a right to our cultural practices that involve our waterways without them being impeded, without being persecuted, without them being decimated, as part of our treaty right, part of our Indigenous right. And that's part of the feeling of our communities where that's been lost and it's taken away and those rights aren't being respected. I don't think it's understood that this is part of a community's identity. We'd like to restore our streams, to restore our springs. We can work with irrigation, but it has to work within sustainable limits. We have to understand what those sustainable limits are environmentally and culturally. This is the whenua we have, and this is what we've got to live with. So there's no going anywhere else. We're here for the long haul, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why we take that long-term approach, because we've been here for a long term and we're not going anywhere.
There we go. So I don't know about you guys, but that was pretty smooth for me. So hopefully you've all got good internet connections and it wasn't too jumpy for you, but you know, encourage you to watch again later if it wasn't all right for you. I want to go to you first, Niall. Obviously a big part there in the film, and some interesting issues that you and I have discussed many times over the years. But I mean, what's your reaction is sort of one thing, but maybe more specifically, kind of, you talk about a hard conversation that we have to have there, particularly Hawke's Bay, but New Zealand. Are you starting to see that conversation being had, or do you think we have some way to go?
Kia ora, Tom. I te tuatahi, ka tika rā me mihi au ki te mana whenua o Paritua me Karewerewa. Rātou e mau ana te Māori o tēnei wāhi, tēnei takiwai o Ngāti Kahungunu, neke atu i te tahi mano tau ki muri, e mihi mutunga moku ara ko te whānau huata, ki tāku pāpara ia etika, i te rangatira, moi mai rā. Tēnā koutou. Ko wai au, ko Waikaru moana te waikaukau o aku mātua tipuna, ko te uruwera te kāinga no rātou mā, ko Ngaio Tiuka hau. So, I just wanted to first acknowledge the hapu of Heretaunga, and ngā hapu o Mangaro and Korongo Tāmarai, and also just passing of my uncle Etika, Iri Huata, who was a keen fisherman, mahinga kai, mara kai, and it's also appropriate to acknowledge him and his whānau, in particular, and the hapu, in particular his siblings who have advocated, and many others who advocated and fought for the waterways amongst many others. So it's just not me saying that, and I actually whakapapa up north, and my kids were born and raised here. Yeah, sorry, Tom, what was your original questions?
No, you're right. I was just going to get your reaction to that, but specifically around that hard conversation that you said. Right. There's I think the film does a great job of kind of discussing what we talk a lot about over allocation, and to most people maybe that doesn't mean something, but you talk sort of about how it's taking more water from the system, from the environment than the environment has to give, and we have to have a hard conversation about how we kind of pare that back. And I was wondering, are you starting to see that conversation being had, or do you think we've still got some barriers to get through?
Oh, I definitely think we've got some barriers. These issues didn't happen overnight, and there's been a steady increase in abstraction without really understanding how much water can be abstracted before it has adverse effects. So, I talked about the irrigators taking too much water beyond what's sustainable, but there's not a decent recognition of tangata whenua and our values in being here. The rest of the community, and impacts on the community. I mean, we had the largest gastro outbreak in our recorded history, and that's related to the same, our same water bodies for our groundwater. And it's not entirely the fault of irrigators. We should be having the conversation with regional council and be treated as they treat basically industry and irrigators in terms of tangata whenua. The lid needs to go back on the lolly jar. If we look at water as being basically a lolly jar put on the table, and all the kids that come in who want the water or lollies, they've been able to help themselves, and they're on a sugar high and they want more water. We heard in the recent catchment proceedings for Tank, you could change a variety of apple and it won't use as much water. It won't be over allocated, but without putting those restrictions on the amount that's been taken, and there's no restrictions to the groundwater. It's been a bit of a free fall, and the common rhetoric from councils to say we didn't understand. They didn't understand, or they thought that it was unlimited. But that means that they've ignored tangata whenua for all this time who've had concerns, because the way it expresses itself is that our springs aren't flowing, or they're missing, or some of the spring-fed streams, they're becoming shorter. So we're not looking to ban irrigation full stop, but it has to work within what's sustainable. And as the point of this, the kaupapa of this kōrero is putting te mana o te wai first, and that has to be the case. It's basically been a rapid, unchecked increase in the last couple of decades. So the discussion, we need to claw it back, but that's not what's being proposed. We had 10 years of stakeholder discussions, which basically entrenched the status quo, and looking at, another 10 years of likely decline, because it's a locomotive you've got to stop. Really.
So you talked about how historically in Hawke's Bay, but also across New Zealand, irrigators, and it's not the fault of the irrigators necessarily. It's this whole system that everyone sort of played into, but the irrigators' desires or requests for water basically have been kind of first and foremost in the hierarchy of not only those who are making decisions, but actually the policy that's kind of backing it up. And you mentioned there that we needed that everyone else needs to be kind of treated in that same way. And the new national policy statement for freshwater, which people might know something about, but is basically some direction that says where we have to go with water. And there was a lot of sort of media coverage about it, flips that on its head a bit. And we've mentioned te mana o te wai, and in the film you talked about te mana o te wai, putting the needs of the waterway first. How do you you explained it in the film, but kind of how do you see te mana o te wai what do you see that looking like in Hawke's Bay? And do you see the new national policy statement really, previous policy used to talk about enabling use of water, basically. It talked about other things, but that was a key part of it. Whereas this new policy flips it on its head. Do you see that that new acknowledgement of Te Manawa Te Wai? Do you see that kind of giving the community and mana whenua a greater role, a role that is equal to kind of the irrigators in the past, or are you struggling to see how it's going to play out?
Well, I definitely think it means we have a greater role. And our first point, my first point made, we need to have that partnership as tangata whenua with regional council, because we're being treated as afterthought and mitigate adverse effects to us, not avoiding adverse effects to us. So it has flipped everything on its head. But if I use the analogy of the lolly jar, people are going to be kicking and screaming, just like kids for lollies. They want their water. And we need to be the parents here and say, look, that's enough lollies. There's not enough to go around. You've had your fill. And we don't expect things to change overnight, but I've had the argument that we're going to ruin the economy, going to ruin development. You're jeopardizing this millions of dollars of investment. That's not the case. It's only relative to time to transition. And I haven't seen any maneuvers. We've had this 10 years of the stakeholder discussions, and we've had, proposed a plan that will last for another 10 years without the substantive changes. So if we can make incremental changes over time in the right direction, I think it just negates the whole, you're affecting the economy. People are forced to adapt. Otherwise, you're going to deplete all the resources, and we're not going to leave. We're going to be left a degraded state for future generations. And I don't think anybody wants that. I mean, the worst fear I have is, well, actually what's happening now, what's worse than contaminated water quality for people to drink is no water to drink and having to spend thousands of dollars of households and communities to get access to the water. The community at Bridge Park, their bores run dry because you got $1 million pivot irrigators next door, and we're supposed to have this compulsory value of human health. So really, the onus is on some of our leadership, not just to say these nice words about these reforms for the environment and water. And we've got these 3 water discussions that shows people's cartoons of people swimming with fish bowl. There's no water in some of our rivers, so people aren't swimming with anything. So it will take time, and again, time will solve the issue of the economics, but we don't need to understand that. Putting the river first, we'd say, well, what is our sustainable parameters or limits or targets we need to have? And we need to have that discussion with people who have that interest in mind. I'm advocating for, if you're for sustainability Te Manawa Te Wai, we should design the management framework and take it off those who've actually caused the problem, because they don't seem to be able to solve it, in all honesty. I'm a little bit different than what Marnie said about putting the house, we actually do want to take it back over, take the management of our waterways back over, and then they can come to us. We'll work together, but we want to be in the driver's seat, because in the small time that we haven't been in the driver's seat, they've made a few crashes. They've had a few crashes.
That's a really good segue into one more question that I just want to ask you, which is covered in the film, but for people who, in terms of that where we're going, it might take time, but that place that we're going is really going to be centered in Te Manawa Te Wai. And for someone who, doesn't necessarily know what that's going to look like, because, it's sort of spelled out in the policy, but it's policy, and it's a little bit, it's not, that simple. It's not something that can be expressed necessarily in words. For you, Te Manawa Te Wai, what does that mean, or what does that look like in Hawke's Bay if we actually have a framework that, puts the water first and is consistent with this idea of Te Manawa Te Wai?
Yeah, I think it's not that complicated. I mean, if you're interested in putting that water body first and using mātauranga, using knowledge, using science to understand that instead of politics and policy and planning, we create that framework of how can it exist? And that knowledge exists already, or how can we manage it? it's just that with all these competing interests, which are the second and third tier, what have you, of Te Mano Te Wai framework, keep on blurring the lines. So we just park those interests, you know, they sit outside the tent for a while and we discuss what does the sustainable management of the waterway looks like. And it might not be achieved overnight, but we shouldn't let that, you know, distract from that discussion. Then once we say what it's looked like, then we have to work on a timeline, the phase, and change the narrative or the management framework, and then you start bringing others inside, because they're always gonna, in terms of if you're getting a commercial value of return of exploitation, you're just gonna keep wanting and wanting more. So that's lower tier down discussion or priority. So we shouldn't, in my view, engage them at that first discussion of setting the rules in the policy and planning framework.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thanks, Niall. I want to jump across to our next speaker, which I think is going to be Levi. Levi, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe, you know, give your reaction to the film and where you think people can kind of engage in these issues, or what a useful thing for people to do is.
Oh, kia ora tātou. Mauri ora ki te sui. Mauri ora kia tātou. Yeah, ka noho au i te I raro I te tirohanga o kaurāna ki maunga, I te tau o te tuki hei rere mai I ngā rua hine atu ki te moana nui ākiwa ki te whanga nui rua wharo. Heck, I was getting my different tohunga mixed up. Engari e tū au I te papara o Matahiwi. Nā reira, e mihi ana ki a tātou. Hei hui, hei hono atu rā, tātou ki a tātou. So, my name's Levi, here over in Here Taunga ways, born and bred. And cool little film, eh? It was massive just to see one of the ways that we can, have seen a whole lot of documentaries that, sort of highlighted it. But loved just hearing the little bits of what our kids were saying. What our kids were saying alongside what's the take alongside what's the reasoning behind it, and just the reality of it and seeing it. But yeah, I think it was the first time that I'd seen it with our kids there, just sort of hearing the little comments, because our kids don't care about who's watching. Our kids don't care about what's the right thing to say or anything. They just say things, they're just straight up. And so yeah, just appreciated that. Heard the bro say, I'm pretending to skim a rock. I was like, oh, massive. Like, harder, you can't act that one. That's just raw. So yeah, no, it was massive. Yeah, ka nui te mihi. I guess
I was just going to say, you're obviously relatively young yourself. What kind of, for me, I see that kind of stuff, and I, as a kid, you kind of grow up, and that's your norm, right? That's the norm of whatever environment you grow up in. How do you kind of see things? How do you kind of react when you see kids like that in the stream? When Niall's talking about being able to, do bombs and jump off trees and whatever, and then there's, his kids having to pretend to skim stones in the stream. What do you kind of? I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but where do you see the future for those tamariki in terms of places like this, and what's our role in kind of making sure that, I guess, that isn't the norm? It's that simple, really.
Yeah, all right. So I think I'm a little bit different. Where we'd go down to the river, but you'd almost go down to the pools more than you'd go to the river. So that's my generation. And then with my brother, my younger brother, my cousins who I take out, they don't even know how to swim with a current. They don't know what a current is when I took them into the river. Like if I think about it, we've got a creek down the road from where I grew up, and I never knew that that was there because none of the whānau would use it because it's yuck. And when I went back there at the start of the year and had a nosy, all I saw were beer bottles. So like that's the reality, you know, in terms of what I'm seeing of our kids and how they engage with this stuff. Like they're not resources that you can live with. They're not places of Māori. They're not a supermarket, you know, they're not a dairy. They're just a drain. They're just a thing that you drive past. They're things that have rubbish in them. They're things that you'll eventually see a lawnmower down, like that's all they are. Like in terms of like how I've sort of started to engage with this stuff around our wai is more around, heck, I actually don't know what a good river is like. Like, I just know that if I'm going to be drinking it, well, heck, you might get sick, but I'll just deal with that. But actually nowadays it's like, actually, no, we got to be real careful about that. Whereas our kids won't know any better. So how do I connect them to understand, well, what is that like? What is a good river? What does that look like? How can they get to know what to do with a river if they don't even go down? Like we talk about pipiha these days quite a bit in our schools, but it's like, heck, our kids don't go to our rivers anymore. You know, so first things first is you can't help someone you don't know. So let's take them down and let's get them to know their river. Heck, you can't ask someone what they need if you don't understand their language and they don't understand yours. You know, so like, yeah, for me, the first thing is just getting our kids to these places and getting to know these things. Because like, cool, there's the mana of the wai, but there's also the Māori. Like, you know, and unless you're going and listening and sitting and being with that Māori, then how can you say that you know it, that you understand it, that you have a relationship with it? You know, it's not just sort of chuck $20 in the donation bin and you're good to go. Actually, it's bigger than that, eh? So, yeah, I guess that's sort of how I look at it, is how can we get our kids to engage in this stuff? How can we make it real? How can we make it alive? Like, you know, our kids are obviously sort of struggling with the boredom of school, or that's what I see is, you know, heck, English is only an avenue, but you need substance behind it to create it, to make it real. Same with our math, same with our engineering. You know, everything that Ngaio was talking about in terms of the straws, like that's engineering. How do we get our kids to play with the stuff and figure it out? I think one of the schools, they were doing stuff around growing trees. And so I was like, cool, how do we do this with a stream this wide? Like it's right next to your guys' school. The sun comes over at this angle at these times. So how do we make sure that the temperature and the water is right for these kinds of fish? They live in these sorts of climates, like all of these sorts of things. We've created a whole lesson plan around it. Like kids way prefer that. They're just sort of writing about, this is a cabbage tree. You know, like you've brought it to life, you've given it purpose. And like, yeah, I guess sort of that's how I try to look at it, eh? How do we get our kids to these places, give it purpose, get to know it, and, you know, as we give our life to it, it'll give life to us.
Yeah, thanks, Levi. That's really, I think that puts two really cool perspectives. One being that engagement with a place to understand its importance and its role it has and how it works and all that, but also what Ngaio was speaking to, which is actually, you know, these places are more than just sort of a word in a pepeha for some. It's really you know, a place that you understand and you know, and if that's lost, then it really does kind of just become a word in a pepeha, which is really it's kind of lost everything that it should be. So yeah, that's really cool and awesome to hear about the work you're doing on that front, and props to others who do that kind of work around the place with schools and getting kids to engage, because it's so important to understand the environment and how it works, and that these things don't have to be the norm, and they aren't the norm. I want to go across to you, India, and if you're still awake, I don't know what time it is over there. I'll let you. I don't want to put people wrong as to where you are, but maybe you could tell us just where you are really briefly and why you're there, and then yeah, give us your thoughts on the film and kind of what this means to you, and how you've engaged with these sorts of issues in New Zealand, but also internationally by the sound of it.
Yeah, kia ora, Thomas. Kia ora, everyone else. And thank you for taking your time to listen to us. For me, it's the morning. So I'm in Glasgow right now. Just arrived last night. Have been flying and driving and journeying for the last few days. And I'm here as part of an Indigenous youth delegation to the UN climate talks. And I've been going to those since 2015, actually, since the Paris climate negotiations. And so part of that work is advocating for Indigenous rights at the international stage, making sure that whatever agreements are made ensure that our rights and sovereignty are protected, or at least that we can work towards that, hopefully, because yeah, some of the UN processes aren't the kindest to the aspirations of Indigenous peoples. But really, I should introduce myself. I grew up at between Waipatu and Homoana. Our whānau whenua is still at Waipatu, and my koro, Rangi Logan, is buried down at Te Pairo in central Hawke's Bay. So our whakapapa spreads right from the Rangitane through Kahungunu to Rongo Wahine. And yeah, it's my patch of paradise. It's the place that I love. It's why I do what I do. And same with ensuring that that place is as bountiful as I remember it, but for my siblings and future generations. And just in terms of the film, I mean, it's so interesting just to hear those reflections about the ways in which the environment has changed. When I was little, I remember going to the rivers and swimming there, and then it was about 2012, 2013, actually, that our friends and I would be looking for places to swim during the summer, and we just couldn't find anywhere that wasn't filled with riverweed and was a bit stinky or like too shallow to do the bombs. Like the bombs are the reason we go, you know, and to be able to really immerse ourselves in that water. And I think even living coastally and being connected to Te Moanui Kiwa and being in the place where our island was lifted from the ocean, really, to me, embeds the idea that our whakapapa is made of water, and it's intertwined with that, and that because it's our special source, it's our magic source, that it is the essence that we should be looking after. And I think it's really interesting as well to be talking about the agriculture take, because it's so, I guess, historically, politically fraught. And I guess what comes to mind actually is for the last couple of days I've been at Cambridge University doing a bit of conversations and stuff like that with some people coming up with some interesting solutions, but also visiting the Taonga Māori collection at the Cambridge Museum. And what they have in that collection is a lot of the taonga that Cook took during his first voyages across the Pacific. And so even just noticing that relationship and thinking about the relationship to the first arrival of Cook and the British Empire, and then the legacy of colonization in terms of displacing our people and creating an environment in which our water isn't being looked after, and the imposition of governance systems that are incapable of looking after our water in a way that means that they can be used for future generations. And then you kind of see the spillover of that economically. Like I remember when I was little, watching news articles on the 6 o'clock news about how intensification of farming was this new way to unlock the GDP basically and increase economic wealth for New Zealand. And then a lot of ways in which that was done was to pivot farmers towards more intensive farming, which meant taking on a lot of debt in order to be able to pivot. And then basically asking the Hawke's Bay region to continue to extract more and more resources at a higher and higher rate in order to be able to maintain New Zealand's GDP and feed the rest of the country. And I think that those hard conversations also need to include people in Hawke's Bay saying, you know what, no, we are not your prop to be able to maintain some kind of international economic wealth that doesn't come back to our people. And we cannot continue to keep sacrificing our resources in order to be able to feed the rest of the country. because particularly in the context of climate change, Hawke's Bay is in for a really rough ride in terms of the impacts projecting right out to 2100. So we need to be really thinking about how we make our region resilient and really rethinking those economic structures, which I know is such a taboo to talk about in so many ways. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's really the way that it has to go, because otherwise our communities are going to continue to suffer and we're going to lose even more of our rivers, and that is in such contradiction with the whakapapa that gives us life. And for me, that ultimately means, to be able to put Te Mana o Te Wai first, that we have to return to good governance, and that means returning to Indigenous governance. And that's what I wholeheartedly believe in and will advocate for forever until the land asks me to return. Yeah, that's my ramble in the early hours of UK.
Thanks, and yeah, that's very impressive for early hours of the morning rambling. If you'll let me, I'll ask you a couple of questions, because it sounds like you've got so much experience in this sort of realm. But those hard conversations, Niall talked about having these hard conversations in the film, and you've just talked about these hard conversations, not just about water and how we manage, but about decolonization and governance and these kind of things. How do we start those conversations? How do we have those conversations? Because you're probably having a lot of those conversations at the UN, and it sounds like it's hard there, and it's obviously been hard in New Zealand for communities and tangata whenua to challenge governance structures or get engaged in consultation processes, let alone partnership or governance. How do people start those conversations, tangata whenua, but also people in the community that want to support that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I probably have a two-part answer to that question, which is firstly, we need to think about why we're not trusting Indigenous governance. And for me, that comes down to embedded systems of racism and white supremacy. 80% of the world's biodiversity is in Indigenous territories. We know what we're doing, and that's really, really clear. And so for me, people who don't trust Indigenous governance need to think about the ways in which they've internalized racist ideas about Indigenous knowledge systems. And locally born knowledge systems are the best to be able to navigate how to look after our environment and our people. And so we should be really throwing all our weight and backing behind Indigenous communities to be able to be resourced to do this work, because we do this work for free already because it's an obligation and it wouldn't be any other way, but it would be nice to be able to pay the rent while we do it, or to be able to live on our land while we do it. And I think the second thing is, particularly thinking about our young people, our young people really understand how we got to where we are, and that's because of the gifts of intergenerational knowledge and handover. And so we know the whakapapa of how we've got into here. And so we need to be letting our young people lead these conversations, particularly when it comes to being politically active and being activists. And I know for our young people, this is such stressful, anxiety fueling work. And even for my younger siblings, it's a regular conversation thinking about how our mum's home moves from homoana when sea level rises, or what are we going to do in times of the big wildfires, because they've been happening yearly now and they're going to increase. And so for me, it's also about how do we have conversations that unlock pathways of action, because action and activism is the quickest pathway to hope. We can't sit around and just talk about it and then hope folks will listen, because it's been done for a really long time, and a lot of people have been doing incredible work within the system, and I don't want to whakaiti that at all. It's just how do we get more people behind that and really mobilizing that and sharing the resources. Some people really know how to do this kind of work, both in the revitalization of our environment, but also how to achieve political and societal change. And so how do we support the sharing of that knowledge? And I do think there does need to be safe spaces for our young people and our Māori communities to be able to come together to talk about these things amongst our own, rather than having to do a whole lot of explaining to other people, which takes up a lot of time. We would look to our allies to be able to do that work for us, so we can get on with the important work. because part of why I'm at the UN and spending my time there is just explaining the basics about why Indigenous leadership is important, rather than off doing what I studied actually, which was archaeology, and that's where I'd love to be. But we've got this other important work to do first. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And ngā mihi ki a koe mō tō whakaaro, and mō tō wā for your time, because here we are having you explain these things, which we really appreciate. And maybe I can ask one more question before we see if there's any questions from the audience. And if you do have questions for India, Levi, Ngaio, or Marnie, please chuck them into the Q&A. But India, you talk about safe spaces a bit, and not having to spend this time explaining these things and all that. And I mean, you know, I certainly almost can't imagine what that's like, but I've seen you know, people like Ngaio have the same conversations over and over and over with regional councils, and so that's kind of, you know, one huge problem. Do you think there's another barrier to, you talked about young people kind of engaging and becoming activists and being really engaged in these issues? Do you think there's a kind of, I'm going to say stigma, but it's not quite the right word, attached to kind of the notion of being an activist, rather than being seen as sort of a concerned citizen or someone who cares about something, and that is, you know, people are given less power or credence because of being labeled as something like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole conversation about how Māori are stereotyped as people who are active in the social change space, and the ways in which we can be misinterpreted as just being angry or raging, rather than articulate and intelligent and experts in these spaces. And I think part of it for me is that, yeah, activist only covers a little bit of what we do as Māori. And so it's quite a narrow term, but it's a term that I've become comfortable with because I prefer it over environmentalist. Because I would say I'm not an environmentalist, because to defend the land and to protect our people and to reduce poverty is all the same thing. It's not just about protecting the environment for me. And so that would be the term that I would kind of bristle at, rather than activist per se. I think part of it is depending on like who you label as an activist. And for our young people, and we even saw it with the school strikes, is it can be a way of is diminishing the mana of those who speak from that place of activism. And actually, if our young people are willing to get in the streets to be able to see the change that they want, then that is one of the most honourable things that I could ever see happen. To be able to kind of take charge in that way, and to say, okay, yeah, we know that the situation is not good, and we know that the structure of society is built against us in terms of listening to us, but we're gonna do it anyway, and we're gonna like muscle our way into being heard. And so I think, yeah, I just have the utmost respect for those young people who are doing that, because it's not the work that we necessarily wake up and dream of doing, but have to do because it's required of us in order to be able to see these visions that have been laid out. In order to be able to see our young people back doing bombs in the river, and being able to fish and feed ourselves from the river as well. And so, yeah, fine, call me an activist if you're getting uncomfortable about what I'm saying, but it doesn't make it any less true. And so I would encourage everyone to become an activist, because it's such joyful work actually to be working in the space of making a better world and bringing those visions into life. Yeah.
Well said, I think. I think that is a beautiful place to leave it, and maybe take some questions in terms of the Q&A. So we've got a few questions coming through. If you do have a question for Ngaio, India, Levi, or Marnie, please chuck it in the Q&A. Well, we've got them here. They have amazing brains that we should exploit and get some information out of. I'm going to go to some in a second, but I think there's one that may be sitting on people's minds that I want to go to you first on, Marnie. and that is we're talking about a lot about the issue here, which is water. The new sort of government direction in terms of water. People are talking about 3 waters and all this stuff. It's in the news a bit. It's kind of everywhere and has been for several years. And we're talking about activism and what people can do. What can people do in the immediate sort of coming weeks, months, years in Hawke's Bay, but also across New Zealand in terms of engaging in the freshwater space?
Thanks, Tom. I would say the first thing that they can do is if they're listening to us, they can put their name in our form so that we can connect and keep connecting and as I say, build the capacity to support the kinds of work that that India and Ngaio and Levi are doing, and to push for the water being put first, and push for Te Mana o Te Wai to be truly implemented through our councils, but also just through our communities as well, and how we, the culture around how we treat our land and our water. There's always things to do. I think it would be good to pass over to Ngaio after this, just to talk about sort of what's coming up in Hawke's Bay, but coming from a freshwater campaigner sort of point of view, the kinds of things that I can imagine us doing together are working on basically outward facing campaigns in the Hawke's Bay to explain some of this publicly. You can talk things into, you can talk change into being, and you can talk action into being. And at the moment we've had so much talk around, India described the conversation that was the big public conversation about how we need to double our we need to intensify our land use, we need to double our exports. I think that was a conversation under the last government. We've had these conversations about which have prioritized particular things, and we can shift that conversation, and we can shift the ground that we're all working on by having that outward facing conversation. And the way that I can imagine people listening, I don't want to be too presumptuous, because I imagine that there are quite a few people listening to this who actually have huge amount of experience and knowledge and have worked on this stuff for many years. So let me just speak to the people who are coming in this fresh, not those people who have been doing that really hard work for a long time and having those hard conversations. For the people who are just starting out, there are things that we can do today, and there are things that we can do collectively. And I would say today, the thing that you can start doing is write to your local newspaper, get your voice out into the public and be heard. And our local newspapers, our letters to the editor, they seem like kind of stuffy old things that may be like, who cares about it, and like, nobody reads the newspaper anyway. But actually I think that that's an untapped community power that we have by writing letters to the editor, because when we put our voice in there and we make sure and we write about the things that we care about and we tell the story that we care about in the newspaper, the more that newspaper editors and journalists see those voices coming through, the more likely they are to do stories on the things that we care about. If they're only hearing from people who have financial interest in exploiting waterways, then those are the stories that they're more likely to run. So it's kind of you can start out really small, but have a big impact in just writing 200 words to your to Hawke's Bay today and saying, actually, do you know what, I'm seeing too much water being taken here, and it's time to start turning that around. And then I think we need to start doing things together after that, and working on some things that are coming up. And perhaps that's where we pass over to Ngaio to talk about the kinds of things that are happening in Hawke's Bay. And I also saw Ngaio was interested in answering that 3 waters question as well. So I won't cover that off. I've done a lot of talking.
Thanks, Marnie. Absolutely. So we'll get to that question, but Ngaio first, since Marnie mentioned it, obviously you've been working on these things for years in Hawke's Bay. What are some ways that people can engage in Hawke's Bay and these issues beyond, writing to the paper or, voting in the local elections or things like that?
It's really hard, I guess, to participate in some of these processes. There's so much information, and I sort of want to say, join us in these submissions, come to these hearings, these conferencing or court mediation. I just say court mediation all day today for outstanding water bodies in Hawke's Bay. But that would put people off. Unfortunately, it's pretty horrible. But I just reinforcing what Marnie said, that just being active. And the comments, I say, put pressure on your politicians. There was a comment that perhaps some of you guys, some of the others here should be politicians. But perhaps I know there are many advocates across Hawke's Bay in different ways and different forms, and it takes a whole sort of moving beast. But that narrative I say about, or that we've all talked about, te mano te wai, put water first. If it's written into policy, we got something to kind of leverage. Let's keep that narrative up to say it looks like this, and that's why I take every opportunity to say putting water first means those who want to generally put water first should be part of this initial discussion, and put that pressure on the politicians to give meaning to the words te mano te wai, or is it just token? I mean, I'm of the opinion, take it away from the policy or legislation if you ain't going to do it justice. Just the kupu mana and the mana of our water. People have, New Zealanders have a good understanding of relatively good understanding, if there's any Māori word, and it's mana. And to not give it the mana that and just put it there, and then we'll consider all these other externality or all these interests is not justice to that phrase. And working within sustainable limits. I mean, I've been working with scientists and planners and lawyers, or talking to them, like sort of yourself, Tom, and just asking a whole lot of questions. And I remember the rhetoric common themes from one of my friends, Kate MacArthur, said sustainable limits. It has to be sustainable limits. And it's just reverberating in my mind that without these numbers of how much you can take, how much contaminants you can put in, and they're quite detailed, without those strong numbers, then and monitoring, firm methodology and spatial management, you can get away with anything, and it's open to discretion and interpretation. And that has, I want to bit us in the ass, basically. And so I'm a staunch advocate for, let's put it on paper, sustainable limits. I'm sick of these powwow chats with land users and councils. Put it on paper so we know what we should expect. And tune into more discussions like this.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned there was, having sat through those processes with you in mediation court and hearings and all sorts of stuff. Yeah. I agree with you. It's pretty off-putting, and it's hard, and it's a time commitment, and for people to lay people to do. Although, like you say, Marnie, we shouldn't say lay people, because I'm recognizing the names in this chat, and I know that a whole bunch of people that are attending this have spent many more years than some of us working in this space. But no, the conversations that councils will have to have in advance of, so people might not know, but councils have to go through a process now of basically addressing some of these issues, because some national policy has told them that they have to do that. And part of that is engaging with communities. So presumably there will be some easy ways for people to engage with the council, even if it's at a relatively high simplistic level, saying, jumping on a website and saying, actually, that's a place that I swim and I really want to be able to swim there forever, and I want my kids to be able to swim there. Or, I live here and this place is important to me, or I whakapapa to this place and this is important to me. People can engage through that way, I assume.
Yeah, there's the Kotahi Plan in Hawke's Bay that's coming out, which is trying to cover all of Hawke's Bay for all the catchments, the regional policy statement, the coastal plan. I think it's too broad, and they should first bring in the region-wide policy aligned with the national policy before they go to catchments. And you can engage in that, and like you say, put down that relationship with your waterways. Under the treaty, we should be afforded that relationship with our waterways, and with our treaty partners and others who may not whakapapa like us, they have formed a relationship with waterways too. And why can't we talk about that being part of their culture and identity, and not just this abstract, like you say, this is our pepeha. It's that pepeha has origins to a relationship with the waterways, and we want to continue that, or we're sort of, excuse the pun, we're watering down our very identity and how we came to be tangata whenua, tangata of people of the land in the first place. So no, you're right on, Tom. There's lots to contribute to, and for those, if there's experts in various fields, please, if you can, offer your services. We need ecologists, hydrologists, even people, all kinds of campaigners like Marnie, people creating videos, comms people. I mean, I'm not too good on social media getting messages out, but that's the forum to get to people. You'd be surprised. We could do with any help. I've already got a register of helpful people, and I get all kinds of advice from a lot of upstanding citizens, free. And I don't think I ever could repay everybody who's sort of helped, and continue, including the people who've created this video and this ActionStation. So just like the mihi to those Marnie and the team, Tom, everyone put in the effort for this. This is an example of thinking outside the box.
Could I just add to that, Tom, and just support what Niall's saying, and just make it just for the people listening who are thinking, yeah, actually, like I do really want to get engaged in this, and I do want to help. I don't have a whole lot of like expertise necessarily, but I have energy and keenness. You don't have to be. The idea will be that we create sort of ecosystem, for want of a better word, around some of this work that's going on around the kind of more intense, like perhaps like less kind of sexy, like hearings stuff. Like you might not be necessarily required to be an expert witness at a hearing, but you can support the work that's going on in those hearings to get the right outcome by being part of a wider campaign and just offering your energy and being part of like a coordinated campaign that's supporting that work. So yeah, just wanted to make sure that people knew that that while stuff is pretty hardcore, and it's you've got people like Ngaio with a whole lot of technical expertise, you don't necessarily have to do that to support the work that Ngaio and others are doing.
And I've learned a lot, if not most of it, in the job, like the planning aspects, the legal aspects. I just perhaps if I could answer those three water questions.
Go for it. I was just going to take us to that. I mean, just to finish that other conversation, Marnie, thanks, and Niall, there is a great writer called Rebecca Solnit who writes on all these sorts of issues, and she she said something really much more beautifully than I could put it, but basically, if everyone in society did their little bit of what they could do, no matter what it is, you don't have to be an expert or anything, then we would come a very long way. So totally, that's a cool thing. Oh, sorry, no, I was going to let you answer the three waters question, but you can add to this if you want.
Yeah, just sharing the narrative. I mean, connected to the three waters and the management of our waterways, and people might not know, but when the Brookvale bores were put in Havelock, there was opposition to those bores being put there by the iwi 10 years ago to say, more than 10 years ago, that's too connected to the waterways, and that was ignored. But that should be shameful, and that should be known. Prior to the big gastro outbreak, the iwi took the regional council to court to protect existing policy that protected our groundwater, and this should be unfathomable. Everybody should know that there was efforts made to protect our drinking water, groundwater resource, and the verdict for that came out a year or two prior to the biggest gastro outbreak. So I mean, we do these efforts and they actually on paper. We had we set case law for water quality, national case law for water quality, but not a lot of people know. And then in a couple of years, fighting the regional council, and it's just not for tangata whenua. I mean, it's our drinking water, it was for everybody, but we felt that protecting the aquifer and our groundwater, we're fortunate to have the likes of the forest and bird looking after our native flora and fauna, and fish and game, about the well-being of our waterways, but the aquifer sort of fell between the gaps. So we thought we had to advocate for that, which seems like a logical interest to protect our drinking water. It's just crazy. So that contamination outbreak was the catalyst for the 3 water reforms. And 3 waters is sewage, drinking water, and stormwater. But the reforms, from my view, even though the drinking water was the catalyst, it's not actually necessarily going to solve any of those issues or improve our drinking water. It's all about service delivery. So I call it 2.5 waters. That it's not quite covering our drinking water. We need to protect the source of our drinking water, which would be more to the point. So it's kind of a separate discussion, because these reforms, the changes in 3 waters, won't actually address water allocation. And I think it should be perhaps 4 waters. I mean, I'm all for changing it up if they're not doing the right job, but the 4 waters would address the water allocation and source protection. But we can target central government, like put pressure on the politicians about water first sustainable limits, and make the 3 waters more meaningful and on target for what was the catalyst, or what was the reason why we had these reforms in the first place. Do we have more hope that tangata whenua will be given leadership partnership role? And 3 waters is about service delivery. So it's not so much protecting water, from my mind, but logistics on managing investment into those areas of stormwater and sewage, which needs more investment, because at times our local council have said, oh, perhaps we don't want to do that, which is a core function of council. It's in the RMA, and they get interested into this economic development and investing in stupid stuff, to be honest. So this takes it away from that discretion on when to spend their budget, and enforces new entities to spend money on these core functions. But there's a lot of uncertainties on for these reforms and changes going forward on what will actually come out in the wash. But in terms of my interest, in terms of resource management, 3 waters is a little bit of a distraction, unless they increase it from the 2.5 to 4 waters, and basically, for my mind, overhaul our regional councils. They're being made responsible for looking after most of our natural environment, but to put it bluntly, they're looking after people who are exploiting our natural environment. They're 2 different things. So perhaps that needs to be separated and changed as well.
Thanks,
they're making
Niall.
all these reforms.
Yeah, lots of the sort of net of issues gets wider. There's one question. We've got about 10 minutes left, so maybe fire through some questions relatively quickly, so that people get some answers to things they really want to know. One interesting question that's come up that I want to put to you, India, is I've heard you speak about zones of sacrifice. How does this concept relate to Hawke's Bay? I'm curious about what this is.
Yeah, so sacrifice zones is something that has been talked a bit about in the climate change space for a while, particularly by journalists like Naomi Klein, who basically identified areas in which the current system chooses to basically sacrifice it for the economic well-being and the broader nationhood well-being of the rest of the space. So a very typical example is the tar sands in Canada. So they identify an area which just gets to have everything taken out of it. It's destroyed. It's sacrificed in order to be able to maintain the colonial economic system as it currently exists. And for me, when I use the term sacrifice zone, I also mean it in a sense of acknowledging the ways in which communities are identified for sacrifice for the broader colonial system. So a lot of, our people or Pacifica people being forced to work 3 jobs just to be able to pay rent in order to be able to keep the system functioning. And it's also connected to an understanding in the Western world about how to protect the environment. So this idea that fences are built and areas are identified that are to be protected and not touched and not even interacted with by humans, because there's not the understanding there that humans can have good relationships with the environment and Western understandings of how to be in good relationship with our surroundings. And so those are segregated off. Maybe we can go into them in huts or on tracks and that kind of thing, but we can't touch it, we can't eat it, we can't forage from it, that kind of thing. And then so the other areas that aren't protected become sacrifice zones that can have anything done to them. And so it's really important to also understand that, this also applies economically. And so Hawke's Bay is actually a sacrifice zone for New Zealand, in which more and more and more is being asked to be pumped out of it and extracted from it in order to be able to maintain the economy and to feed everyone. And so these kinds of conversations around protecting water are also essentially about how do we redo how we extract resources from particular parts of the country. And so even like in Tamariki is a sacrifice zone for the fracking of fossil fuels. And communities are just asked to pay and pay and pay. And this came up actually a lot with Ihu Matau, whose maunga was mined to be able to make Auckland roads and build the airport, and then was being asked once again to sacrifice land to build some houses on that weren't even good houses. And so it's important when we're thinking about what communities and areas that we're advocating for, that we make sure we're thinking about them in terms of these sacrifice zones and how much burden is being placed on people to just give. And those are the communities that we should be in solidarity with and defending and protecting, because they're at the hard edge of a lot of systems that inflict violence. I hope that made sense. Actually, in my head, I had way better explanations for it. And I do just want to quickly add, actually, because we're talking about these political opportunities, is that the emissions reduction plan consultation is out right now, which is basically the government consulting on how to reduce emissions. And it's not good. They're not focused on justice at all. So how we make sure that we have correct leadership, particularly Māori leadership in the climate space and the environmental space, that's not just tokenistic or consulted, but is actually like leading. So I'll drop a link in the chat for the consultation, just to go in there and write a submission saying, do better, Māori should be leading this. And that would be great. And then the other thing is actually next year is local elections. And so we're going to have a chance to elect people to our regional councils, to our district councils, that will be informing what we do about water moving forward. And then on top of that is also the Resource Management Act reforms. So these big sweeping legislation changes that are going to be mandating possibly sustainable limits and how we make decisions around the managing of the environment. So I would say just keep an eye out for all of those things and have potlucks with your family to talk about what you want to do about them, because meeting over food is the best way to do it. Yeah.
Thanks, India. Awesome answer. And yeah, a lot of reform coming up, and it can be daunting for some people, but maybe I want to take one question to you, Marnie, but firstly, you're probably answering something by text. The daunting legislation element, you've delved in the space a lot. How do you deal with, the things that come up? Do you prioritize one over the other? Do you pick one to start with? Do you just give yourself a small thing saying, I can write 200 words and I don't have to worry about anything else for now? How do you overcome that sort of barrier to activism, for want of a better description?
That was a question for me, wasn't it? Sorry,
Yeah.
I was in the middle of typing out an answer to somebody. How do I overcome that? I've basically overcome that by focusing my energy on water. Rivers are the thing that I love the most. I love everything about them. I'm sorry, Ngaio, I do often forget about the groundwater, and then I try to remember, because I'm a sucker for the beauty of like the rivers as they go through the landscape. So I focused a lot of my attention on water, and that's the way that I've sort of tried to make this more manageable. But as you can hear, this is an issue that, you know, that all our environmental issues, they go right across. You know, water is connected to climate, is connected to biodiversity, is connected to agriculture, is connected to resilience, is connected to social justice, is connected to intergenerational justice. All these things are connected. And so the thing that I always remind myself of is that while I'm working mainly on water, I connect with people like India, I connect with people like Levi, I connect with people who are working across other parts of trying to address the kind of crucial issues that we have and the key issues that we have. And I see myself as one connecting part of that work. And I don't try and cover everything. I just I remember that I'm one part of that connecting work, and I also try to work as hard as I can to create opportunities for other people to do stuff as well, because I think that's a key part of making sure that we are all these little parts of the ecosystem.
Cool. And while I've got you, since this is something that you've worked on quite a bit, there are a few questions there that Niall's answered in the chat, but just the alternatives to irrigation, what are they, and kind of what are the big issues in New Zealand that are creating this problem? Niall's kind of said it's actually a range of land uses and it's intensification that's the problem, and he's mentioned something about regen, but what's your perspective on what the alternative is and what the problem is, kind of thing?
Yeah, thank you. And that's actually just I was just in the middle of typing a small novel there for whoever asked that that question. Yeah, so I think that the alternative to irrigation is to look beyond an input model in our agricultural systems. Currently, the way our agriculture, and this is about thinking differently about the way we run our agricultural systems. At the moment, the way that we think about agriculture in New Zealand is kind of in this in a very sort of siloed and blocky way. You know, all our fences are even straight lines. You know, it's like, here is a paddock, we add grass, we add fertilizer, and then we add water, and then we add the animals on top of that. And it's just kind of we're not thinking holistically about how we would manage that land. We're just kind of, you know, it's a just add water approach to building resilience. My view is that we need to be thinking about the landscape in its entirety, and the alternative to irrigation is thinking about a healthy landscape. And a healthy landscape will have diversity. A healthy landscape will hold water in the landscape, so it will hold water in things like the soil, it will hold water in things like forested areas, it will hold water in things like wetlands, and so that we don't have, I talked in my little novel about, we don't have environments that are constantly on the brink all the time. You know, you look across the landscape in many parts of New Zealand, and there is not a single tree, as far as the eye can see, that is not a landscape that is going to be resilient to drought. It's not a landscape that can regenerate itself should there be a drought. So we need to, the alternative to irrigation is shifting our focus and thinking, okay, what does the land need to be able to support our food and fiber production, rather than what does our food and fiber production need to take from the land for it to work. We've got to shift that starting point. And I can see that I work sometimes in agricultural spaces, and I can see that shift is starting to happen, but it's really not fast enough, which is why Te Mana Otiwai, I think, is a really powerful and important part of this new policy, and we have to make it work. As Niall says, it's not just about having that word on the page, it's actually about making sure that thinking is really embedded in our decision makers and in our communities, and particularly within our agricultural system, because what agriculture does really matters to the health of our land and our community and our waterways.
Thanks, Marnie. We've got time for one more question, I hope, so we can finish on time. And it's a big question, and it's been acknowledged as that. And I'm not sure who I'm going to let take it, but whoever has a thought can do so. Put your hand up. I know it's a big question, but what thoughts have any of you had about decolonising activism spaces for tangata whenua, kaitiaki and rangatahi? Outside of the system, getting the persuadables on side with Mātauranga Māori-led organising. I imagine this is something that Levi, India, no, you've probably given quite a lot of thought.
What about Levi? Because we haven't heard from him.
Yeah, Levi, you work in the space a bit. What's your view on decolonising activism spaces for tangata whenua, and probably youth is where you work a lot?
Yeah. I'll be really like the whole the theories around stuff sort of aren't my jam. So like around decolonising and all that. I personally don't care. I'm going to do me. I'm going to look after me and I'm going to look after our kids. So like in terms of like how I've learned about stuff. So I'm no pro at water. Like I went and studied about people and then didn't actually go to uni much. Like Indy can attest to that, uni together. What I did was I went and talked to people who knew about stuff and I hung out with them. I got mates with them and that's how I've learned. That's how I've gotten opportunities, was the fact that they just saw that we cared, that we wanted to know more and we wanted to do something and we did it. So like in terms of like persuading the persuadables, I think a whole lot of the people that I've engaged with have been really keen for the fact there's someone who just wants to learn what they know, how to do things properly. We'll check them on stuff and then do it and try it and test it. And like, that's pretty much the perfect way to go about teaching our kids. Well, let's just try this. It's an experiment. Let's learn this together. Let's do it. You know, like, I don't know if that's sort of decolonising it. I mean, heck, our generation of young Māori are the most to go to university ever, you know, and educated, and proportionately there's more Māori in university than Pākehā. Like, I appreciate that there's sort of this colonised system, but at the same time, like we've got the advantage of being able to navigate both to the extent that we've never had before, you know, and Pākehā can't do that so well. So like we've almost got an advantage in this way. We have the two strengths. So yeah, like, you know, in terms of decolonising the space, I think it's more like, let's build relationships. I mean, there was a kōrero from one of our local fellas who has just passed away recently, actually. And he talked about, heck, you fellas have been telling us that we should be one people for so long. And like, I'm all for it. You guys should come and be Māori. When are you ready? Like, you know, for me, that's the kōrero way. Like, we're just going to do what's right. We're going to be us. Let's go build relationships and we'll figure it out together. You know, like, yeah. And heck, I'm not saying we should all be Māori, but it's just sort of this kōrero of like, let's build our thinking together, build what's right, and slowly it'll just happen. But I just focus on our kids because at the end of the day, it's the kids who are going to go home to their farming parents and say, oh, why are we doing this when this is the case? Like, why are we doing this if this happens? If the stream's like that, oh, that seems a bit odd, you know, because our kids are the ones who are going to pull up their parents. They do that for the cultural stuff. When they see sites, they start to tell us about it. They start to invite us around, like they start to open up the kōrero where their parents have always just been too scared. You know, their parents are scared of us, but they're not scared of their kids. They love their kids. So it's like, for me, that's how I open it up, or by just going to learn. But yeah, appreciate I'm in the privileged space of being able to come in behind all of those like Ngaio who have been fighting in the battles where they've had all of those sort of years, decades of just real racist stuff that's been built up. I've got the privilege of being young, Māori, keen, and just coming in after all of the hard yards have been done in the generation where people are keen to open up the doors. Like, that's my privilege. And like, that's how I sort of use it. Work with kids, young, Māori, keen to learn, just want to do good stuff. Like, yeah.
Thanks, Levi. That's awesome. And I wish we could keep talking about that, to be honest, because it's a whole nother thing, you know, this, like you say, the theory of decolonization and then the stuff that's actually happening out there. And it would be really cool to talk about, you know, like Ngaio, your perspective on it and all that kind of stuff. But we've run out of time. If anyone's really desperate to add 10 seconds on anything, we might be able to get it in. But otherwise, I might ask if someone, Māui te karakia, if someone wants to karakia, we can. But before we do that, I just want to say props to Marnie for your work on putting this film together. Levi, Ngaio, India, all the work that you do. People can obviously find what you're doing out there on the internet and the things that you do. And India, you know, you posted that thing in the chat if people want to put submissions on the climate change stuff. If people want to engage in this freshwater stuff, Marnie has put that link to put your email onto that form in the chat. And hopefully people are interested in, you know, supporting the work that you do, or supporting whatever outcomes it is that they want in their community and their region. So on that note, thank you very much. Thanks, Marnie.
Before we go, can I just say a massive thank you to Ben Sarton, who was the filmmaker for this. He did the he shot it and edited it and just made it look really gorgeous. And so just really grateful for his work as well.
Kia ora. Niall, I mean, I'm happy to close with karakia if you want, but if you want to do something, seeing as you're there in Hawke's Bay doing the mahi on the ground, it feels like maybe I should give you the last word.
Kia ora, Tom. And also just want to reiterate to all the contributors and the team who, you know, supporting the kaupapa and the filmmakers. You needed to do a bit more airbrushing on me. I'm sort of like in some way. But not kia ora, much appreciated. Kia whakaria te tapu, ka wātia ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai. Uye tā ki.
Yeah. Kia ora, ngā mihi kia koutou. Have a good night, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Kia ora, everyone.
We'll see you later.
Po Māori e, ngā mihi nui.